My talk today is on how classical architecture can unite Americans in an otherwise divided time. But can architecture really have that power? Can it shape our behavior, our thoughts, and feelings? In a speech on the rebuilding of the House of Commons, which had been bombed in World War II, Winston Churchill famously said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." He claimed that the Parliament chamber, in which the political parties sit facing each other on opposite sides of a rectangular room, helped to foster Britain's beneficent two-party system. He pointed out that in order to switch parties, a politician must quite visibly stand up and walk across the room. By contrast, in the seating arrangement of the French Parliament, which is semicircular, a politician can gradually move to the left without anybody noticing. There is a grand tradition in architecture that extends back to ancient Greece and Rome. One of the foundational buildings in this classical tradition is, of course, the Parthenon. It was built by Pericles to demonstrate the glory and supremacy of the city-state. The power of the building's architecture succeeds to this day. President Obama acknowledged it during a visit to the site in 2016. He said in a talk in front of the building, quote, "It is here in Athens that so many of our ideas about democracy, our notions of citizenship, our notions of rule of law began to develop. And so when you visit a site like this, not only are you getting a better understanding of Greece and Western culture, but you're also sending a signal of the continuity that exists between what happened here, the speeches of Pericles, and what happened with our founding fathers." As you know, the art, architecture, and philosophy of Greco-Roman tradition was revived in the Renaissance. Later still, the classical tradition recrudesced in early American public buildings. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson personally oversaw the competitions to design the US Capitol and White House and influenced the designs of the buildings themselves. Washington and Jefferson were both talented gentleman amateur architects, and Jefferson was an actual genius. Jefferson had grand ambitions for new American architecture. He aimed, quote, "to improve the taste of my countrymen, to increase their reputation, to reconcile them to the respect of the world, and procure them its praise." Among his masterworks is the Virginia Capitol, based on an ancient Roman temple in Nîmes, France. It was the first American building constructed in a pure classical temple form. Highly innovative for its time, in its Romanism, it was the first public building in America to reject the English colonial tradition in architecture, thus representing a kind of cultural independence. Jefferson not only founded the University of Virginia in 1819, he was also the architect of the campus. Here's a vision of what the campus looked like in 1826. He said he designed the Rotunda Library to represent the authority of nature and power of reason. The building itself is inspired by the Pantheon from ancient Rome, as is the Jefferson Memorial itself in Washington, which was completed in the 1940s. That is the quote-unquote modern era. This building, I should say, as an aside, was completely hated when it was proposed, hated by the modernist architectural establishment. The dean of Harvard's Graduate School of Harvard's Graduate School of Design said that it was an egg on a pantry shelf in the midst of a geometric Sahara. But FDR, as president, intervened to ensure the design was built. Washington and Jefferson consciously decided that the nation's capital and its most important structures were to be classical in design, the physical manifestation of the American form of government and its political aspirations, including such values as good order, benevolent hierarchy, and reason. This decision connected the capital to the ideals of Republican Rome and democratic Athens. The founders inaugurated a national idiom using the traditional vocabulary and grammar from the classical world. The White House and Capitol, the Jefferson Memorial, and the Lincoln Memorial, they are universally recognized symbols of the United States that Americans take pride in. In a national poll done by the American Institute of Architects, These 4 structures were listed among Americans' top 10 favorite buildings. And if I could give a very brief tour of American classical federal buildings, of course, we start with the White House, which is relatively modest in size. It was never meant to be a palace. This is the original drawing for the U.S. Capitol building, which was greatly expanded over time, and a larger dome was eventually built. Here's an example of Greek Revival in Philadelphia from 1824. And this is the Patent Office in Washington, D.C. In 1901, the Treasury Department codified existing practice by making classicism the official federal style. Instead of squelching good design, there was an efflorescence of it. This, for instance, is an example of Beaux-Arts architecture in New York by Cass Gilbert, the U.S. Custom House. This is a very modest post office in a town in Texas that no one's ever heard of, showing the dignity that classical architecture can provide, even in a humble setting. This is one of the buildings in the Federal Triangle, which was constructed in Washington in the 1930s. Here is a classical skyscraper, showing that the classical tradition is capable of building, designing skyscrapers in very large buildings. This is in New York City. And this, of course, is the U.S. Supreme Court, built in the 1930s, again, in the modern era. Now I'm jumping ahead. Okay. However, after World War II, the federal government agency overseeing government architecture abandoned classicism in favor of modernism. During the mid-20th century, the government built the generic boxes and, to a lesser extent, the steel and glass cages that came to exemplify corporate America and international business. One of the directives that the government follows to this day is that, quote, design must flow from the architectural profession to the government and not vice versa. In other words, the government, that is, the client, abdicated authority. It allows the elite private sector, that is, the client, it allows the elite private sector, which is entirely modernist, to dictate design to the government. I just showed 2 generic modernist buildings. Here is one designed by Mies van der Rohe. This is a federal courthouse, though, of course, when you look at it, you have no idea what sort of building it is. Might as well be an office building. And very interestingly, there's a new movie, relatively new movie, about a famous trial that took place in this building, the trial of the Chicago 7. But in the movie, this is the building they use for the courthouse, and the interior is also classical, because when you look at this, no one thinks justice. And here is the JFK Federal Building in Boston, designed by Walter Gropius, a very important modernist architect, as is Mies van der Rohe, who I just showed. And here is the inviting entrance to that building. This is the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington by Marcel Breuer, another important architect. 3 different HUD secretaries have said that this building is 10 floors of basement. And one of those secretaries being a Republican and 2 of them being a Democrat. And one of those Democrats also said that the building looked like something from the Soviet Union. At the same time, the executive agency that oversees federal buildings upholds this as an example of excellence in federal design. Here is the FBI headquarters, another brutalist building. I like to call this the Ministry of Fear. And then ultimately, we end up with federal buildings that essentially have no architecture at all. In 1994, the government created the so-called Design Excellence Program to remedy what the government itself, like its clients and the public, perceived to be the abysmal quality of its buildings. The program places high value on quote-unquote creativity and innovation. What we have gotten is stylistic modernist chaos. No more than 10% of the buildings constructed under the program have been classical or traditional. And here's a survey of some of those buildings under the new program, which continues today. Start having these very strange forms. This is arguably some kind of spaceship. This is a federal courthouse in Austin, Texas. Some people joke that it's Jenga texture, if you know that game. Deconstructivist design in Las Vegas, a bunch of pieces that have been stuck together. And at the entrance, you see what might be a gun turret. This is the relatively new U.S. courthouse in Salt Lake City. If you look at it and think, does it remind you of anything? Well, it appeared on the cover of the Salt Lake City Weekly with the headline, "Resistance is Futile, How Utah Ended Up with a Board Cube for a Federal Courthouse." And this, I think, is the worst of the worst, the San Francisco Federal Building by Tom Main of Morphosis. This really does look like an alien spacecraft that's going to kill you with laser beams. This is the side of the building. And the interior, this is in San Francisco. It already looks like it's been hit by an earthquake. Now, this architect, Maine, who the New York Times called the federal government's favorite architecture, he said that in a different courthouse, he put covert guillotines over the judges' benches, kind of as a joke. But he's also said more generally that his designs take an aggressive approach toward the public. Here is a rare example of a new classical courthouse that shows what the alternative to the Design Excellence Program could be. This building exists only because one of the most powerful senators, Richard Shelby, fought to get a classical design. Now, perhaps recognizing the popularity of classical and traditional design, at the end of his term, President Trump issued an executive order that radically reoriented federal architecture. I'm proud to say that my organization instigated the order and had a hand in drafting it. Emphasizing the importance of beautiful public buildings and requiring that new designs be admired by the general public, the order made classical and traditional architecture the preferred architecture for federal buildings across the country. The order was more stringent regarding Washington, D.C., where classical architecture was made mandatory. The order broadly defined classical architecture to encompass everything from neoclassical to Art Deco. Traditional architecture was also broadly defined to include such styles as Gothic, Romanesque, Spanish colonial, and so on. Significantly, the order required that the federal public seek input from the general public when design decisions were being made. Thus, there would finally be an element of democracy in design. In early 2020, a draft of the executive order was leaked, which sparked a firestorm of outrage. The order wasn't controversial among ordinary Americans, but our cultural elites were outraged. The New York Times, in a screed against contemporary classical architecture, published an editorial titled, "What's So Great About Fake Roman Temples?" The editorial said that the founding fathers leaned heavily on ancient precedents, but claimed that American architecture today, quote, no longer needs to wear borrowed clothes. Of course, if classical public buildings today are fake Roman temples, then logically it follows that the Times thinks that the Virginia Capitol, US Capitol, and Jefferson Memorial were equally fake when they were constructed. None of those buildings, obviously, is 2,000 years old. Numerous other media outlets lashed out at the order. Wired magazine fretted about the new architects of fear, while many commentators compared Trump to Hitler, claiming that this was the architecture of white supremacy. Happily, not all of the left went this far. For example, the progressive New Republic magazine, after publishing an article accusing the order of being reactionary, did manage to publish a piece titled "The Non-Fascist Case for Classical Architecture." It was a relief to know that one could like classical architecture without being a fascist. As for commentators on the right, the executive order received widespread praise, with some saying it was one of the best things Trump had done in office. Alas, almost immediately after taking office, President Biden rescinded Trump's order. Biden provided no reason for doing so, but the American Institute of Architects, which is dominated by modernists, had been heavily lobbying him. And of course, there was the weight of fashionable opinion. But what about ordinary Americans? What do they actually want? I have the answer, and I have strong empirical evidence for it. In October 2020, the National Civic Art Society completed a visual survey conducted by the Harris Poll of 2,000 American adults. The survey showed that 72% of Americans prefer classical and traditional architecture for U.S. courthouses and federal office buildings. The poll found a widespread preference for tradition among all demographic groups, including race, ethnicity, age, gender, and socioeconomic status. The survey results were also strongly bipartisan, with tradition being favored by 70% of Democrats and 73% of Republicans. And here is one of the questions that were part of the survey. What we did was carefully pair existing modernist and traditional buildings that were similar in color, shape, scale, and so on, and used Photoshop to make sure the sky was similar, and so on. And the survey asked, which of these two buildings would you prefer for a U.S. courthouse or federal building? And so in this case, the building on the left received 81%, was favored by 81% of the people surveyed, while the brutalist HUD building on the right only received 19%. Thus, it is obviously the case that when the general public sees a classical courthouse, they don't see a fake Roman temple, they see a temple of justice. Consider also the response to the January 6th riot at the US Capitol. Members of Congress on both the left and right bemoaned what they called the desecration of this temple to democracy. It is telling that they used the word temple, and they likewise referred to the sacred. If the US Capitol had been brutalist in style, I don't think anyone would have said that it could be desecrated. You can't desecrate a brutalist, bare concrete design. Although Biden rescinded Trump's order, it has led to a major welcome development. Thanks in part to my organization, there is now pending in the House and Senate legislation that would effectively codify Trump's order and requires even more strongly the inclusion of public input in design. The lead sponsors are Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Jim Banks of Indiana. While the legislation has garnered a number of Republican sponsors, no Democrats have signed on so far, perhaps scared off by the fact that the original order was issued by Trump. In any event, in response to the legislation, Bloomberg News reported that, quote, what was once a fringe campaign to restore classical aesthetics has grown into a mainstream revolt. I note parenthetically that in 2022, Senator J.D. Vance, who is Trump's pick for vice president in the coming election, Vance tweeted, quote, our towns and cities don't have to be ugly. We used to create small businesses that last and beautiful public buildings. There is additional momentous news. The recently announced 2024 Republican National Political Platform states that, quote, Republicans will promote beauty in public architecture and build cherished symbols of our nation. The platform also calls for making Washington, D.C. the most beautiful capital. Is American architecture becoming politically polarized? Is beauty a conservative thing? Or can this be an issue that all Americans can agree upon, or at least all Americans who are not members of the cultural elite? No less than the prominent liberal Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer wrote in 2006, quote, classical forms help convey a sense of fairness, dignity, continuity, and equality in a public building, unquote. And hold on, if classical architecture is the architecture of white supremacy, why did Obama give his 2008 nomination acceptance speech in front of a classical Greek backdrop? There is no great mystery. For ordinary people, classical architecture is quite simply the architecture of American democracy. It is the style most associated with our system of government and our highest ideals. It is the architecture of civic virtue. And I think this is a sentiment that nearly all Americans can agree upon. Thank you.